The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of mechanical locusts, and in that sterile white glow, Margaret Walsh moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU with the kind of invisible competence that nobody noticed anymore. 6 months she'd been here. 6 months of night shifts, of hands that had learned every curve of these corridors, every creak in the tile, every nurse call button that stuck just slightly too long on the 3rd floor. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee clung to her scrubs like a second skin. She didn't mind. She'd smelled worse. The unit was running at half capacity, 2 a.m. on a Thursday, the way hospital nights always felt like moving through underwater, every sound muffled, every movement deliberate. Margaret's age showed in the lines around her eyes, in the grey threading through the dark hair she pulled back in a braid each shift, in the way younger nurses sometimes looked past her as if she were already a memory of a person rather than one standing right in front of them. That was fine. Invisible was useful. Invisible meant she could work. She pushed a med cart down the hall, the wheels squeaking softly against wax tile, and paused at the nurse's station to review the post-op charting on bed for a 61-year-old male, emergency appendectomy, vital stable, drain output minimal. She'd been watching this one carefully. The surgeon, Dr. Pierce, had packed the wound differently than protocol dictated, and Margaret's notes reflected exactly what she'd observed: fluid balance, exact drain characteristics, temperature trajectory. 3 other nurses had signed off on standard post-op reports. Margaret hadn't. Not because she was difficult. Because the patient's wound showed early signs of seroma formation, and signing off meant acknowledging something wasn't right, and she wouldn't falsify a patient's medical record for anyone, regardless of what that cost her. The chart on bed 4 would have gone to the medical director unmodified if Margaret hadn't flagged it. By morning, the chief resident caught the complication before it became sepsis. No one thanked her. No one ever did. The break room was dark when she stepped inside at 0213, and she moved toward the coffee maker with the kind of muscle memory that came from muscle, not habit. Her scarred hands, thin white lines across her knuckles from 18 years ago, ragged marks on her palms from something she didn't talk about, steadied the empty pot under the tap. The scar tissue had long since hardened into something that didn't hurt anymore, but people noticed. People asked. She never answered. There was a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, hanging on the back of the break room door. Just a nurse, the patch read, but underneath in smaller thread someone had embroidered coordinates: 32.96 degrees north, 44.36 degrees east. Tikrit. She never wore the jacket on the unit. Only here. Only alone. The coffee dripped. 1, 2, 3 drops. Steady. And then Dr. Mercer walked in. The chief of surgery carried himself with the kind of polished confidence that only came from knowing exactly how untouchable you were. Custom wool suit, $3,200 at least. Margaret had seen that cut before, shoes that cost more than her monthly car payment, a Patek Philippe on his wrist that caught the fluorescent light like a small surgical lamp. He didn't expect to see anyone else here. The break room was sanctuary at this hour, a place for the cleaning crew and night shift ghosts. His face tightened for just a moment when he registered her presence. Then something else moved across his expression: calculation. A door opening. He'd been running the scheme for 11 months. Margaret knew because she'd been looking for it. The inflated surgical billing, the phantom procedures coded into post-op reports, the pharmaceutical supplies that disappeared from inventory and reappeared on civilian black market distribution networks. $27,000 diverted this quarter alone through padded anesthesia costs and fraudulent implant charges. And Margaret's meticulous charting, her refusal to sign off on questionable reports, her habit of flagging discrepancies, her documented observations that didn't align with the official medical records, meant she could trace every single transaction. He watched her pour the coffee. The silence stretched like a surgical incision, precise and bloodless. "Working late," he said. Just words. Nothing underneath them yet. "Night shift," Margaret replied, her voice flat and neutral as a monitor displaying sinus rhythm. She didn't look at him. The coffee was black, no sugar. She'd learned to drink it like this in Tikrit, when sweet things weren't available and you drank what kept you awake. You've been here 6 months now. How are you finding the unit? His tone shifted into something that almost resembled friendly. Almost. It's good work, she said. Standard answer. Safe answer. He smiled then. A thin expression that didn't reach the precise angles of his face. I noticed you're charting on bed 4. Very thorough. Perhaps too thorough. He gestured with one hand, dismissive. Sometimes in a teaching hospital, we need to understand the difference between documentation and editorializing. You understand. Margaret set her coffee cup down on the counter. Her hands were steady. Always steady. The wound showed seroma formation, she said. I documented what I observed. You documented an opinion. He moved closer. Not threatening. Just closer. We have protocols for a reason. Radiologists read imaging. Surgeons interpret results. Nurses document what we tell you to document. That's the hierarchy. That's how Cedar Creek operates. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The coffee maker gurgled out the last dregs. The patient's temperature was rising, Margaret said, still her voice unchanged, her face showing nothing, no tension, no fear, just the blank professional composure of someone reading a set of vital signs. The drainage pattern indicated bacterial contamination. And it was handled appropriately. He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. Your job isn't to second-guess the surgical team. Your job is to follow orders. And frankly, your attitude is becoming a problem. She picked up her coffee again. Took a sip. The cup was warm against the scars on her palms. Is there anything else? She asked. What they didn't know was that his voice had been recorded by the digital clock on the break room shelf, a clock Margaret had noticed during her second week, the one with a hidden camera function she'd installed specifically to document exactly these kinds of conversations. What they didn't know was that she wasn't a nurse who'd taken a job at Cedar Creek to finish out a career counting down to a comfortable retirement. She was embedded here. She'd been placed here deliberately, by people with badges and security clearances, to track the movement of military pharmaceutical supplies through a hospital supply chain that had become a pipeline for something much larger. And if Dr. Mercer succeeded in forcing her out, if he managed to fire her before she had the evidence compiled and documented, 6 months of intelligence would evaporate like alcohol on a sterile field. Just keep that in mind, he said finally, and he left her alone with the coffee maker's mechanical hum and the smell of his cologne lingering like a threat. She finished her coffee standing at the counter. Her shift had 4 more hours. She had 3 more patients to see, 2 medication rounds to complete, and a 12-bed unit to monitor at 0300 when the worst of them would crash. It always happened around 0300, some law of physics nobody had bothered to name. She turned off the break room light and moved back into the ICU, invisible as always. The night continued its relentless rhythm, monitor alarms sounding in staggered intervals, family members sleeping in uncomfortable chairs outside rooms, the constant hiss of oxygen flowing through tubes and the beep of 4 pumps counting down medications in measured drops. At 0347, a trauma alert came through overhead, and Margaret heard the words that shifted everything. Incoming, male, 63, trauma activation from construction site collapse, Tikrit trained personnel incoming, ETA for minutes. The unit's rhythm changed. Beds were cleared, equipment checked, surgical teams mobilized. Margaret moved with the current, preparing a bay, arranging instruments, doing the 1,000 small tasks that preceded a critical arrival. She didn't know yet that the patient was a Marine commander. She didn't know that someone would recognize in her hands a technique she'd learned in a place that officially didn't exist. She didn't know that in 3 days, everything she'd built here would collapse and be rebuilt in a form that would shatter everything Dr. Mercer thought he understood about power. She only knew that someone was coming who would change the trajectory of her carefully constructed lie. Margaret walked into Cedar Creek Medical at 2,106 hours on a Tuesday, her nursing credentials impeccable and her background sanitized down to the molecular level. 6 months embedded. 6 months of careful documentation, of noting which pharmaceutical shipments arrived on Thursdays, of watching inventory discrepancies that no one else seemed to track. The hospital hummed with its usual evening chaos, call lights chiming like angry birds, monitors beeping their mechanical rhythms, the smell of antiseptic layered over something underneath, something like desperation and fluorescent light. Dr. Mercer had noticed her on day one. Not because she was remarkable, but because she was the opposite. Quiet. Meticulous. The kind of nurse who charted every detail, who questioned dosages, who refused to sign off on post-operative reports that didn't align with what she'd actually observed. He ran his billing scheme like a conductor, inflated surgical charges flowing upward, insurance companies paying without scrutiny, kickbacks routing through shell medical supply companies. $300,000 a year in his personal account. Untraceable. Until Margaret started asking why a routine appendectomy required 7 hours of OR time. The first real test came on a Thursday morning when a patient developed what appeared to be a surgical site infection. The family was gathered, daughter, husband, sister, all hovering near the bed with the particular anxiety of people who'd entrusted their loved one to strangers. Margaret had caught the infection early because she'd checked the wound at 0400 before the official rounds, her hands moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from 17 months in a Tikrit field hospital. She'd changed the dressing, irrigated the site with normal saline, started topical antibiotics before sepsis could establish itself. Dr. Mercer arrived at 0800 with his white coat pressed like a weapon. He moved directly to the bed, pulled back the dressing Margaret had just applied, and his eyes found the family like a predator isolating the weak from the herd. This is what happens when nursing staff decides to play surgeon. His voice carried the particular cruelty of someone accustomed to having an audience. Improper wound care. Contamination. Look at this, amateur hour. The daughter stepped forward. But the wound looks clean. My mother's fever broke. Because I'm about to actually treat this correctly. He turned toward Margaret, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd practiced humiliation like an instrument. Perhaps next time you'll remember that your job is documentation, not diagnosis. Leave the medicine to the physicians. Margaret's jaw tightened. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to notice unless they were looking for it. Her hands remained steady as she folded the old dressing into the biohazard container. She'd been trained to absorb hits, literal ones, the kind that came with IEDs and small arms fire. Verbal ones were easier. She simply filed them away, added them to the growing dossier on Mercer's personality that she was building for her actual employers at the Pentagon. Yes, doctor, she said, her voice exactly even. What Mercer didn't know was that Margaret's improper wound care had prevented a spiral into necrotizing fasciitis. The infection would have required debridement, possibly amputation, a lawsuit against the hospital for negligence. She'd saved Cedar Creek from a $60,000 complication and a family from the worst possible outcome. But he couldn't see that because he was too busy seeing her as a threat. The break room became hostile territory by the following week. Margaret had spent 2 years in Cedar City, had navigated checkpoints and ambushes and the particular silence that came before an attack. She could navigate a break room where nurses stopped speaking the moment she sat down, where conversations about weekend plans died mid-sentence, where someone would always find an excuse to leave. It was strategic ostracism, the kind that accumulated like pressure. The first time it happened, she was reaching for coffee at 0530. The pre-dawn shift briefing window. 3 nurses clustered near the refrigerator, Chen, Williams, Okafor. She poured her cup. The room went quiet in that specific way that meant they'd been talking about her. I'm going on break, Margaret said, which made no sense since she'd just arrived, but the statement hung there anyway like an observation about nothing in particular. Chen left. Then Williams. Okafor lingered for exactly 2 seconds before finding a reason to check the supply closet. Margaret sat alone with her coffee cooling into something bitter, watching the fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in amber. It happened again Wednesday. Again Friday. By the following Monday, she'd learned the schedule. She could predict which nurses would leave and in what order. It was almost mathematical. But the real weapon came midweek, printed on the unit board for everyone to see. A formal write-up. Dr. Mercer's handwriting was precise, the phrasing clinical, performance deficiency, failure to follow established post-operative protocols. Notation in personnel file. Requires remediation training. The write-up was a lie structured like truth. The protocols Margaret had allegedly violated were the ones she followed better than anyone on the unit. The incident it referenced was the infected wound she'd prevented from becoming a crisis. But written by Mercer, verified by the nursing supervisor he'd probably called beforehand, it became official. That same afternoon, she found her locker moved. Not stolen. Moved. From the main locker room on the second floor to the basement hallway, near the laundry facility, in the corridor where the night shift stored equipment that no one wanted to maintain. The locker itself was smaller, dented along one side, the combination lock scratched from years of use. Inside, she transferred her belongings, her phone, her personal items, the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, that small piece of fabric that carried her entire history compressed into 12 square centimeters. Margaret had sewn that patch there herself, 16 months ago, before the nursing cover started. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse. She'd held it in her hands that night, pressed her thumb against the embroidered lettering, and made a choice. The choice to disappear into Margaret Walsh, RN, and become invisible enough to investigate a scheme that operated in plain sight because everyone assumed nurses were background radiation. She placed the jacket carefully on the top shelf of the basement locker and locked it. Then she headed back upstairs for the evening rounds. Mercer watched her from his office as she passed through the ICU. His hands were steepled on his desk in a gesture meant to convey power, the kind of posture men adopted when they felt threatened but wanted to perform confidence. He'd made calls to 3 board members that morning. She'd heard through the hospital grapevine that he'd mentioned her name with words like unstable and questionable judgment. The strategy was clear. Build a narrative. Document problems that didn't exist. Create an official record of failure. Then fire her with justification. What he didn't understand was that Margaret had compiled her own documentation. Not for protection. For leverage. For the people in the Pentagon who needed evidence of insurance fraud structured at the departmental level, of pharmaceutical kickbacks flowing through shell companies, of a chief of surgery whose financial records didn't match his salary. She'd photographed billing sheets. She'd tracked shipments. She'd documented the supply chain discrepancies that pointed toward a theft ring operating with military implications, stolen medications, diverted equipment, a network that ran deeper than one arrogant surgeon. She moved through the rounds with the precise efficiency of someone who'd performed emergency procedures at forward operating base Shank with nothing but field dressings and morphine. The humiliations accumulated like dust, noticed and filed away, irrelevant to the actual mission. A patient asked for someone else, citing lack of confidence. A physician assistant made a comment about her limited understanding of modern medicine. The charge nurse suggested she might be better suited to administrative duties. Margaret charted everything, continued her rounds, and maintained the particular kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. Mercer escalated because he didn't understand what he was pushing against. He thought she was a nurse he was bullying into resignation. He had no idea she was a captain, embedded in his hospital like a surgical probe, documenting every transaction that would eventually become evidence at a federal trial. By Friday evening, she'd already transmitted photographs of the supply chain documentation to her handler through a burner phone. By Saturday morning, Mercer's financial accounts were under review by the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. By Sunday night, the investigation had expanded to include the shell companies, the pharmaceutical distributors, the network of corruption that extended far beyond his greed. And then the commander from Tikrit arrived in Cedar Creek's trauma bay at 0307 with crushing injuries and a construction accident that had nearly killed him, and everything accelerated into the sequence of events that would change the trajectory of the entire operation. The phone in Margaret's jacket pocket, the one with the direct Pentagon line sewn into the lining, would stay silent for exactly 17 more minutes. The alarm started low, a single beep that built into a shriek. 0307 hours. The commander's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular gasps. Margaret registered it instantly, the asymmetrical breathing, the way his left side moved half a beat behind his right. She moved toward the bed without thinking, her eyes catching what the monitors had just begun to whisper, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 68%. His left lung, she said. Not a question. The resident froze, still holding the suture line from the abdominal closure. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the crisis it had failed to prevent. A pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that collapsed a lung and crushed the heart toward the opposite side. The kind that killed in minutes. Call Mercer, the resident said, but Margaret was already moving. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from Tikrit flooding back like a door slamming open. 17 months in a combat surgical unit. 43 lives saved in field conditions without an OR, without blood banks, without the luxury of time. This was different. This was controlled. This was Cedar Creek Medical with everything she needed 3 feet away. The corpsman assisting on the abdominal closure froze mid-stitch. His needle hung suspended over the commander's peritoneum, his eyes widening as he watched Margaret's hands position themselves at the chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The angles were identical. The approach was unchanged by geography or time. He stared at her fingers, at the way she'd already located the landmarks without measuring twice, without hesitation. That's a Tikrit field closure, he whispered. His voice came out strangled, the words nearly inaudible beneath the screaming monitor. I watched Captain Reaper do that exact stitch pattern on a convoy route. Same angle. Same pressure on the needle. Same everything. Margaret didn't acknowledge him. There was no time for acknowledgement. There was only the clock. 62%. She'd already opened the crash cart. A 14-gauge needle. Angiocath. The kind of instrument that looked impossibly small until you understood what it could do, how it could puncture through ribs and muscle and membrane to release the pressure crushing the heart. She prepped the skin with iodine in a quick, efficient circle. No trembling. No hesitation. Her jaw tightened once, a single muscle contraction, and then her face was stone again. Margaret, the resident started, still holding the suture. We should wait for. His pressure's dropping, Margaret said. Flat. Clinical. Pulse ox at 58. Heart rate 142. We have maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. You can hold that suture or you can get me ice normal for the drip. Pick one. The resident moved. Just like that, her voice had changed something in the room's center of gravity. The cadence was different. The tone was command. Not a request. It was a command. She found the intercostal space by feel, the landmarks her hands had learned in conditions where reading an X-ray wasn't an option. The needle entered smooth, perpendicular, through skin and subcutaneous tissue. The ribs resisted. That was expected. She angled her wrist slightly, found the groove, and pushed through. The hiss of air escaping. Urgent. Explosive. A high-pitched release like opening a pressurized system at altitude. The commander's chest relaxed fractionally. The monitors began to shift their rhythm. 59%. 64%. She advanced the catheter, withdrew the needle, secured the line with tape in 4 practiced movements. No wasted motion. No steps repeated. Someone watching closely enough would have seen the difference between a nurse following a procedure and a surgeon executing it, the kind of execution that came from hundreds of hours of repetition in places where mistakes meant body bags. The corpsman was still staring at her. His suture hung useless, his hands frozen. The resident had moved to establish the fall line, but his movements were tentative, secondary. The room had reorganized around her. The nurse, the resident, the corpsman, all of them watching the monitors as Margaret's handiwork took effect. 71%. 79%. Bilateral breath sounds? Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer from the sudden symmetry in the chest wall movement, the way the oxygen saturation curves straightened. Yes, the resident breathed. Both sides. Equal. 85%. 90%. Stable. The commander's eyes flickered open. Not conscious, the sedation was still in effect, but alive. His pupils responded to the penlight the resident passed across them. His blood pressure climbed from the devastating 92 systolic, 104. 116. Holding. His heart rate stabilized into something resembling normal rhythm. Pain was information. Pain was data. Margaret understood this in her bones. The body signals, when you learn to read them, told you everything. This man's body had just told her that she was 20 seconds away from calling time of death. And his body had also just told her through the shift in his breathing, the color returning to his lips, that he would live. She stripped the gloves from her hands with a snap of latex against skin. Disposed of the needle. Documented the procedure in the patient's chart with a clinical notation: needle decompression at second intercostal space, midclavicular line performed 0313 hours, 14-gauge angiocath, immediate improvement in oxygenation and breath sounds. No dramatics. Just facts. Just data. Just another procedure in a night full of them. But the corpsman was still looking at her. He moved closer, pretending to check before, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. Where did you learn to do that? Margaret didn't look at him. Textbook procedure. Any ICU nurse with 6 months of experience could execute it. That's not textbook, he said. That's muscle memory. That's 20, 30 years of doing the same move until your hands don't have to think anymore. I know it because I've seen it one time before. In Tikrit. From someone they called Reaper. And Reaper was. The doors to the ICU swung open. Dr. Mercer stood in the frame, his surgical mask still hanging around his neck from the previous case, his eyes taking in the scene with the speed of a predator assessing threat level. He saw the resuscitated commander. He saw the secured chest line. He saw the monitors climbing back to normal readings. He saw the corpsman standing too close to Margaret, his mouth partially open as if he'd been in the middle of saying something he shouldn't have. And he saw something shift in Margaret's shoulders, not a flinch, not visible to anyone not trained to recognize the micro-adjustments of a body shifting from emergency mode to civilian mode. Just a settling. A return to the posture of a subordinate nurse facing her superior. Mercer's jaw clenched once. His eyes moved from the commander to Margaret and back again, calculating. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The corpsman returned to his sutures without another word, his forehead beaded with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature in the ICU. Status, Mercer said, not a question. Spontaneous pneumothorax, the resident answered quickly. Tension type. Decompressed 12 minutes ago. Catheter in place, bilateral breath sounds, O2 saturation stable at 94%. Who performed the procedure? The silence stretched exactly 3 seconds. Then the resident glanced toward Margaret. Mercer's eyes followed. His smile was slow, calculated, and carried the weight of a man who had just realized that the threat in his hospital had not retreated, it had simply revealed itself more clearly. And now he knew exactly how dangerous she was. He turned and walked out without another word. Dr. Mercer moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a predator circling wounded prey. By 06:13 hours that morning, he had already made his first call. The corpsman who assisted during the needle decompression was being transferred to the orthopedic unit, effective immediately. No explanation. No discussion. The paperwork was already signed. Margaret heard about it from a resident who mentioned the sudden staffing shuffle during rounds, and she understood what was happening. Witnesses eliminated. Testimony scattered across different floors where cross-conversation became impossible. The shift schedules changed next. Margaret's regular nights, the ones where she controlled the ICU rhythm, where she knew every monitor and every rhythm like her own heartbeat, were suddenly fragmented. 3 nights here, 2 nights there, a swing shift thrown in like a wrench into machinery. The pattern was deliberate. She would never work alongside the same people twice. Never build testimony. Never create continuity in what she had observed. By Wednesday morning, her schedule looked like a puzzle assembled by someone who wanted her isolated, untethered, unable to form the kind of working relationships that could later corroborate anything she might say about the pharmaceutical discrepancies she had been documenting for 6 months. Then came the notice in her personnel file. Restricted access to ICU, effective immediately. Cited reason, emotional instability demonstrated during emergency response. Margaret read the words twice, her eyes moving across the laminated paper without any visible reaction, though her throat tightened. Emotional instability. She had just performed a procedure that saved a man's life with the precision of someone who had done it in a firefight in Tikrit. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood, but she didn't allow it to show on her face. She folded the notice and tucked it into her pocket, continued her shift as if nothing had changed, as if the hospital had not just begun systematically destroying her ability to complete her mission. By Thursday, Dr. Mercer had placed calls to 3 board members. Margaret would learn this later from a sympathetic records clerk who mentioned overhearing a conversation near the administrative offices. The calls painted her as unstable, dangerous, a rogue nurse who operated outside protocol, who made independent decisions in emergencies without proper authorization. Which was exactly the kind of nurse who saved lives when protocols failed. But that was not how it was framed. It was framed as insubordination. Recklessness. A liability. Margaret understood, with the clarity that came from 17 months embedded in Fallujah and Tikrit, that her cover was disintegrating in real time. The hospital thought they were firing a night shift nurse who had become a problem. They had no idea they were burning an intelligence operation that had been running for 6 months, that her meticulous documentation of pharmaceutical discrepancies, billing anomalies, and supply chain irregularities, the very paperwork they thought made her annoying, was the only evidence that would prove Dr. Mercer's kickback scheme with the pharmaceutical distributor 3 states over. Mission failure meant 6 months of field work erased. 6 months of carefully cultivated access, gone. 6 months of evidence that could have unraveled a fraud network affecting military hospitals across the eastern seaboard, lost. She had known the risks when she took this assignment. Cover burns. Missions fail. That was the nature of the work. But knowing it theoretically and facing it at 05 for 7 hours on a Friday morning were different things entirely. Security came for her badge at dawn. 2 officers she did not recognize, escorts who did not make eye contact, who simply stated that her access was being revoked pending an investigation and would she please surrender her credentials and accompany them to ensure she collected her personal items. It was not a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of institutional certainty that made resistance pointless. Margaret removed her badge, the one that identified her as M. Walsh, RN, Cedar Creek Medical, and handed it over without comment. The weight of it leaving her neck was like losing gravity. The basement laundry facility was empty at that hour. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the kind of sick, persistent hum that sounded like insects dying one at a time. Margaret stood at a folding table, sorting through the scrubs that had been her uniform for 6 months, and began folding them with the same precision she brought to everything else. Fold the sleeves inward. Line up the seams. Create symmetry out of fabric. It was a meditation, or it might have been if her mind had been capable of meditation. Instead, it was just the mechanical action of hands that knew how to keep moving forward even when the mission was collapsing. The faded unit patch sewn inside the jacket lining, barely visible unless you were looking for it, barely noticeable unless you knew what it meant, pressed against her ribs as she worked. Her call sign stitched into the underside of the collar in thread so thin it was nearly invisible unless you held it to the light. A talisman. A anchor. And now, folded into a hospital laundry bin destined for processing and donation, it felt like she was packing away her own identity, piece by piece. The patch that had been stitched there by hands belonging to a man named Foster, who had been 2 vehicles back during the ambush outside Sanjin Valley in 2011, who had pressed his forehead against hers for exactly 3 seconds before she got back in the Humvee and drove toward the sound of gunfire that had taken him 6 weeks later. That patch. She stood alone in the basement with 48 scrub sets folded into perfect rectangles, and for the first time in 6 months, Margaret allowed herself to consider that she might have failed. That the hospital, the fraud, the whole network of financial crimes that reached higher than Cedar Creek Medical, that it might never be exposed. That Dr. Mercer might walk out of this with a slap on the wrist and a transfer to another hospital where he could continue the same work under a different name. That Foster's patch, this small piece of Tikrit that she carried next to her heart, might be the only evidence of why this mattered at all. Her hands were steady as she placed the final scrub set into the bin. That was something. Hands that had sutured a man's carotid artery in a clinic with no anesthesia, hands that had compressed a chest cavity while rounds hammered the walls, hands that had held a child's mother while she died from complications of a routine surgery that she should have survived but did not. Those hands did not shake now. They were steady. Even as everything else crumbled, her hands remained steady. She reached for her jacket, the one with the patch hidden inside, and something stopped her. Some small instinct that lived deeper than 6 months of cover, deeper than the mission briefing, deeper than the strategic calculation of what she had just lost. She pulled the jacket toward her and felt the patch where it lay against the lining, still warm from her body heat. One small act of documentation. One small refusal to accept defeat. Margaret folded the jacket carefully and placed it back in her locker. Tomorrow she could retrieve it. Tonight, she would walk out of Cedar Creek Medical as just another nurse whose employment had been terminated for reasons related to her psychological stability. Tonight she would go home and wait, and she would let the mission come to her rather than trying to salvage it herself, which was something she had learned in Tikrit, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was keep fighting after the battle had already shifted. She was walking toward the exit when she heard it, distant at first, then growing louder. The sound of rotor blades, the distinctive whump-whump-whump of a helicopter approaching from the north, growing closer to Cedar Creek Medical. Margaret paused in the basement hallway, one hand on the cold metal railing, and she listened to the sound intensify. Then a second helicopter. Then a third. The vibration moved through the hospital like recognition. 3 days of silence. That was all it took for the world to reorganize itself. Margaret's phone rang at 6:51 a.m. Her hands were still wet from washing the breakfast dishes, and she stared at the unknown number blinking across her screen like a countdown timer. Cedar Creek Medical's administrative line. She didn't recognize the voice, a woman's, formal, clipped, "Ms. Walsh, this is HR. We'd like to schedule a quality review hearing. This afternoon. 2 p.m. Conference Room B." It wasn't a request. It wasn't an apology. It was procedural. The kind of call hospitals make when they're building a paper trail to justify something already decided. Margaret said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, "I'll be there." She hung up and looked at her hands. Steady. No tremor. No anger. Just the simple fact of being called back to the place that had ejected her like a foreign body. She understood what this was, another knife, probably. Another way to make sure she stayed buried. Dr. Mercer wouldn't let her simply disappear. That wasn't how men like him operated. They needed the humiliation to be complete. Final. They needed witnesses. The drive back to Norfolk took 43 minutes. Her old hospital materialized through the windshield like a memory she'd been trying to forget. Same sterile parking lot. Same glass entrance. But something felt different in the air now. Heavier. Charged. Margaret couldn't quite name it until she stepped through the doors and heard it, the sound of boots. Multiple boots, moving in synchronized patterns through the lobby. Not normal. Hospital security moved alone. Slovenly. These footsteps had military precision. She made her way to Conference Room B with her shoulders level, her breathing measured. Dr. Mercer stood near the head of the table, his tailored suit catching the fluorescent light like polished armor. 2 hospital administrators flanked him, pale, nervous men whose eyes wouldn't meet hers. Mercer smiled when he saw her. That predatory smile. The one that had become his signature over 6 months of calculated cruelty. Ms. Walsh. Thank you for coming. I think you'll find this hearing quite. The door opened. A man in a marine dress uniform walked through, still moving slowly, still carrying the weight of his injuries like a second skeleton. The commander. His left arm was strapped against his torso, his movements careful, deliberate. But his eyes had changed. They carried something they didn't have in the ICU. Recognition. Clarity. He looked directly at Margaret. Across the table, across the distance of everything that had happened in the last 72 hours, and whispered one word. Reaper. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system breathing. A Marine lieutenant colonel stepped forward, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing carved from absolute certainty. He opened an official citation, the kind with gold seals and signatures that matter, and began to read. His voice was steady as a metronome. Captain Margaret Walsh. Decorated combat surgeon. 17 months embedded in Tikrit, Iraq. Navy Cross for Valor under fire. He paused. Each medal landed like a fist on the table. Personally responsible for saving 43 Marines during Operation Phantom Fury. Mercer's face drained. Not because of the rank. Because of the number. Because everything he thought he was stood suddenly against everything she actually was. A 2-star general stepped forward. His uniform hung with ribbons that looked like a map of every conflict the last 30 years. He moved to Margaret's locker, the one that had been moved to the basement, the one she'd forgotten to empty, and drew out the small patch of faded fabric sewn inside her jacket lining. The unit insignia. Colors almost gone. Threads holding it together through years of being worn close to skin. The general saluted her. A full salute. His arm rising from his side to his brow with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime honoring the weight of that gesture. Your decorations speak to a level of service this man cannot comprehend, the general said, his eyes still fixed on Mercer's face. Captain, welcome home. A Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit stepped forward and handed Mercer a folder marked in red letters, classified. The liaison's voice didn't waver. Captain Walsh's nursing assignment was a sanctioned counterintelligence operation investigating your supply chain, Doctor. Specifically the diverted military pharmaceuticals. Specifically the 9 months you've been selling them to private clinics in 5 states. Specifically the $420,000 in unmarked deposits to an account in Cayman Islands we've already frozen. Mercer lunged forward, his face contorting. That's insane. That's fraud. She's impersonating a federal. The general raised his hand. Not violently. Just raised it. And Mercer stopped mid-sentence like his body had forgotten how to move without permission. The general's stare had the weight of command authority, the kind that doesn't require voice. You're finished here, Doctor. The next 30 minutes happened like choreography that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Margaret sat in that conference room while the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked through the doors, badges catching the light, boots striking tile with purpose. While her employment record was officially expunged. While Cedar Creek's board of directors walked in looking like they'd been punched. While Dr. Mercer's hand started shaking, actually shaking, as he realized the depth of what had found him. But what really ended him came from outside the hospital. 150 military officers in dress uniform spontaneously filled Cedar Creek Medical's lobby. They came from bases across the Atlantic Fleet. They came from NCIS. From JSOC. They came from 3 different states, and they formed themselves into an honor cordon, 2 perfect lines of dress blues and dress greens, their ribbons catching the afternoon light like a wave of recognition. Local news caught it on video. The kind of footage that gets shared until it reaches the people who matter. Reached Dr. Mercer's medical school mentor, a retired Army surgeon named Colonel Richard Halloway, 73 years old, a man who'd trained half the surgical talent on the East Coast. Halloway saw the video of Mercer screaming at Margaret in the parking lot, caught by a news camera as security moved her toward the gate. Saw his former student's face twisted with rage and desperation, saw the way Mercer's finger jabbed at her like an accusation, saw the utter lack of recognition in his eyes, no awareness that the woman he was destroying had medals the army had to issue in closed ceremonies. Holloway made one phone call to the state medical board. Then he made a second call to every major hospital system from Boston to Richmond. Then he wrote a letter, a single page in his own hand, and posted it on his office door where his colleagues could see it. I trained Dr. Pierce Mercer in surgical technique and professional ethics. One of these two disciplines clearly failed to take hold. I am disassociating myself entirely from his legacy, and I recommend every institution do the same. What I witnessed in that parking lot footage was not the action of a surgeon. It was the action of a man afraid of being exposed, willing to destroy a decorated officer rather than accept accountability. I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent. The state medical board suspended Mercer's license within 18 hours. Every hospital system pulled his privileges simultaneously. By evening, the story had moved beyond local news into national coverage. Military honors nurse reveals hospital fraud scheme. Margaret stood in the break room, the same break room where staff had started leaving when she sat down, and watched the footage play across a staff member's phone. She saw herself standing silent as Mercer raged. Saw the perfect stoicism on her own face. Saw the commander's hand reaching out to steady her even as his body protested the movement. She didn't smile. But something in her shoulders lowered. Some weight that had been pressing down since the moment security walked her out of that basement laundry facility. Some weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with restraint finally releasing. 3 weeks later, Margaret testified at a federal hearing. She spoke about the pharmaceutical inventory discrepancies. About the billing patterns that didn't match actual procedures. About the way Mercer had escalated his attacks precisely as she got closer to understanding the scope of his operation. About watching him understand, in that conference room, that he'd been destroying evidence in human form, that the person he'd tried to erase was the same person who'd been systematically documenting his crimes. The sentencing came down on a Thursday. 12 years federal prison for healthcare fraud. 5 additional years for conspiracy with private distributors. Restitution of $612,000. But what actually broke Dr. Mercer, what the newspapers didn't focus on, was the administrative aftermath. Within 90 days, he lost his hospital privileges, his private practice license, and his position at the university where he'd taught surgical residents for 15 years. The board voted unanimously to rescind his tenure. His name was removed from 3 published papers. His ex-wife's divorce attorney called to renegotiate the settlement based on criminal asset forfeiture. 6 months later, Margaret drove past a medical supply company on the outskirts of Norfolk. She wasn't looking for it. It just happened to be near the VA clinic where she'd started volunteering. She saw him through the front window, Dr. Mercer in a polo shirt with a company name stitched on the chest, loading boxes into a white van with the medical supply company's logo on the side. His movements were slow. Careful. The hands that had performed surgery for 27 years now shifted cardboard boxes with all the grace of someone whose entire world had turned to rubble. A name tag on his shirt read, Supply Associate. Not doctor. Never doctor again. He looked up as her car passed. For one moment their eyes met through the glass. And Margaret saw something in his face that she'd never seen during all those months of calculated cruelty, the absolute knowledge that he'd lost. That he'd tested himself against someone he didn't understand and had been broken by the collision. She didn't slow down. She didn't wave. She simply drove past and returned to the work that had always mattered, back to Cedar Creek Medical, which had installed a new VA wing in her honor. Back to the ICU where the commander had asked to stay for his rehabilitation specifically because Captain Walsh was there. Back to the night shifts where she could keep working quietly, keep saving lives without ceremony or recognition. The hospital offered her chief of trauma within a year. She declined. Offered her director of surgical nursing. She declined again. Asked her what she wanted, what would make her stay. She was already there. Already in scrubs. Already in the place where the fight had always been. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that the quiet victories were the ones that lasted. That the person who'd held restraint through 6 months of humiliation was the same person who'd saved a commander's life at 0307 hours with nothing but muscle memory and absolute certainty. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, let me know in the comments. And subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us.